social. And so I was invited to organize this group. It was a group that already existed. I am not primarily a historian of Hasidism. I've written a number of things about it before this book, but it's probably because I edited a book called Cultures of the Jews that may be of interest to you, 23 essays on different Jewish cultures, that I was asked by my colleagues to be the director of the project. And my idea was that this book has to be written by a team, but it has to sound as if it's written by one person, which is very difficult to do. Furthermore, the only way to make this work is we have to take everyone away from their home, put them in some place which is not their home, and make them work together. And so we were able to get a grant for 4 years in the summer to be in the Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig, Germany. And we lived there pretty much together. We wrote together, we worked together, we argued with each other. And on Sundays, we didn't work. We took trips in the countryside to different towns. And I think the trips were as important as the rest of the week because we became really good friends. And then when we had controversies, arguments, and of course, we had a lot of them because this is a group of very, strong personalities who have very strong ideas. We had arguments, but as Moshe Rossman, who is one of our group, said at the end, we had many disagreements, but in the end, we're still friends. And I think it's true. And this is, for me, perhaps the most wonderful academic experience that I had in my whole career was working with this group and producing this book. So let's get to what the book is about and what the book is directed against. Our goal was to summarize the best scholarship on Hasidism to date. That is, to date, meaning we started the project in 2011, and the book came out in 2018. So in that period of time, based on the best scholarship, not only our own, but using all the resources of other people working on Hasidism, that was our goal. Now, the earlier generation that wrote about Hasidism, Simon Dubnow, of course, wrote the first history of Hasidism. Gershom Scholem wrote about Hasidism. Martin Buber, you're familiar with these names, of course. Their basic argument was that Hasidism is a kind of romantic revolution against the rabbis. It's somehow a attempt to give a voice to the average person, to create a popular movement of religiosity and spirituality, and that its golden age was in the 18th century, the era of the great Hasidic masters, who, of course, wrote some of the most important books. Now, our argument, as you'll see in a few minutes, our argument is actually quite different, that Hasidism arises actually within the elite of the Jewish communities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century. It is not really a rebellion against the rabbis at all. It is not a romantic movement, as people like Dubnow portrayed it. And that, in fact, its golden age, as I'll argue, was really in the 19th century, much more than the 18th century. A further argument of our book is that Hasidism, which is seen and sees itself as anti-modern, as a bulwark, a fortress against the modern world, that in fact Hasidism has to be considered part of the modern world, a phenomenon that never existed before in Jewish history, and that gets a lot of its energy precisely from creating an identity against modern secularism. And that is part of the story of modern Jewish history. It's not outside, this is not simply a medieval movement, it's not really medieval at all in many ways. For example, the social structure of Hasidism, a wonder-working charismatic leader called in Hebrew tzaddik, or in Yiddish Rebbe, the leader of a group of Hasidim, with a group of followers who are not necessarily living right there where he is, but are scattered around at some distance. This is entirely new. We have no examples of this phenomenon in earlier Jewish history. So this is a social structure that is new and unprecedented. Now, Hasidism emerges in Eastern Europe, in a milieu in which you have wonder-working rabbis called Biale Shem. It means someone who controls the holy name of God and can use it for magical purposes. And of course, the founder of Hasidism, we'll turn to him in a moment, Israel Baal Shem Tov, was such a Baal Shem. He was a magician. He wrote amulets. Let me go back to the screen for a moment. The Baal Shem Tov, in the treatment of people like Dubnov and others earlier in the 20th century, Baal Shem Tov was seen as this rebel against the community. He lived out in nature. He was a simple person. He was uneducated, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now Moshe Rossman, who is a member of our group, back in the 1990s discovered, it's a fantastic discovery. We all wish to have such a discovery, but he was fortunate to have it. He found in the tax rolls from the town of Midjibuj, which is where the Baal Shem Tov was, the name of the Baal Shem Tov in the tax roll, and you can't see it here because it's too small anyway, it's written in Polish, and it says that the Baal Shem Tov was a Kabbalist, and he lived in the community of Medjugorje as an official of the community, and he lived without he didn't have to pay taxes, and he was given a house by the community to live in rent-free. Now, what is this all about? What it's about is that these communities needed the services of Baal Shem. Before modern medicine, antibiotics, the only protection you had against illness was an amulet, a magical formula written on a piece of paper, or it could be engraved. The Baal Shem Tov knew how to do this. He knew how to write these magical amulets using the various names of God. And so he was an integral part of the communal elite of the town of Medjugorje. He gathered around him, one could say, a kind of, I wouldn't call them Hasidim because they didn't use that term yet in the specific way that it comes to be used later in Hasidism. In early 18th century Poland, the word Hasid, and this goes back really to Germany in the Middle Ages, it means a pious person, but more specifically, it means someone who is more pious than the law, who engages in various practices, what we call penitential practices, to get rid of sins. These sins can be actual violations of the law, or they could simply be sinful thoughts. This was actually apparently a great obsession of these Hasidim, that when they were praying, they would have a what they called a machshava zara, a alien thought, probably a sexual thought, and this would distract them from their prayer, and they had to figure out a way of suppressing these thoughts. And so what they would do is they would fast in the wintertime. They would go and sit in an icy river. In the summertime, when the river was not so icy, they would sit instead on a hill of ants to do these things to force themselves not to have these thoughts. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel Baal Shem Tov, or Besht, it's an abbreviation of his name, he was part of this milieu of Hasidim, we could say written with a small h, but he had a different approach than the other Hasidim in Poland, and he gathered around some followers who he taught his particular approach. And so there's a very important, we have very, very few writings that we know for sure came from the Baal Shem Tov. Very, very few. He wrote a responsa, that is a rabbinic legal response on a particular point of law. We have many statements that are quoted by this circle of colleagues who knew him, but we don't know for sure which were authentic and which were not. This one, I think, is very, very likely to be authentic. And he says here, he's writing to Yaakov Yosef of Polonoi. Yaakov Yosef was the preacher in the town of Polonoi, also part of the rabbinic establishment. And he became very close to Israel Baal Shem Tov. And he wrote him a letter. And in his letter, he said that it is mandatory to fast. In other words, Yaakov Yosef was part of this culture of Hasidim, of pietistic men who believed in a kind of asceticism. And the Baal Shem Tov disagrees with this. He says, my stomach was agitated by this declaration, and I hereby react by the decrees of the angels, and together with the Holy One, blessed be he and his presence, you should not put yourself in danger like this. For this is an act of melancholy and of sorrow, and God's presence will not inspire out of sorrow, but only out of the joy of performing the commandments, as His Highness knows the things I taught several times. And do not deny your flesh, God forbid, to fast more than is required or is necessary. If you heed my voice, God will be with you. With this I will be brief and say shalom for myself, who seeks your welfare constantly. Signed, Israel Besht. So this is the original teaching now of the Baal Shem Tov. That is, that God must be worshipped with joy and not with fasting, with tormenting the body in various ways. And so he emerges out of this circle of pietism, Hasidut, we could say, with a small h. Of course, they didn't write with Latin characters, and there are no capitals in Hebrew or Yiddish, but Hasidut in the sense of pietistic practice. Instead, the word Hasidut, or more specifically, Hasid, or the plural Hasidim, comes to have a new meaning after the death of the Besht. Its meaning becomes now the follower of. You are a Hasid of the Baal Shem Tov. You are a Hasid of Dov Ber, the Magid of Mezrich. And in modern secular Hebrew, you can use the term in a completely secular fashion. I am a Hasid of Bibi Netanyahu, for example, you could say, if that's what you wanted to say. I am not. But in any case, the word now acquires this new meaning, which is a follower of, and it points to the new social structure. that emerges not really in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, but only in the next generation, with a number of his colleagues who begin to gather around them a circle of followers, or Hasidim. And these, in particular, Dov Ber, the Magid, or the preacher of the town of Mezrich. He was a very learned scholar in the field of Jewish mysticism, and he gathered around him what we would call a court. And actually, we have a description of this court by a Solomon Maimon, who was a young a rabbinic scholar from Lithuania, who heard about the Magid of Mezrich, and he walked hundreds of kilometers to sit in his court at his table and to see what happened there. And he wrote a description in his autobiography. Now, later, Maimon abandoned Orthodox Judaism. He went to Berlin and became part of the Haskalah, part of the Enlightenment. And he wrote a very important memoir, which is kind of an ethnography of Eastern European Judaism. And he describes the court of the Magid of Mezrich. Now, the Magid begins to develop these followers. They go out and establish their own courts. Perhaps the best known today would be the youngest of these, Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He established the group called Chabad, or Lubavitch. And of course, you probably know this because I'm sure in Sao Paulo there's at least one Chabad house, maybe more. They are everywhere. That's part of their movement. We can come to talk about them later on. This movement of missionizing over the whole world is something that occurs later, although it already has its roots in the 18th century. And so these different followers of the Magid go out and establish their courts. And this comes to the attention now of so a map just to show you for a moment. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an enormous, the largest country in Europe until it's cut up by its neighbors, which is at the end of the 18th century. But at the time when Hasidism starts, in the middle of the 18th century, it's still a united country. And in the southwestern area, here we see Midjiboj. We write it in the way it was pronounced in Yiddish, Midjvij. Here is Mezrich, where the Magid was, and here's some other areas, Polonoi, Koretz. These are a number of the centers of Hasidism in the 18th century. There aren't very many, and they are limited really primarily to this area of southeastern Poland. But accounts of this new group come to the attention of the greatest rabbinic scholar of the period, named Elijah, also known as the Gaon of Vilna, which Gaon means something like luminary, the luminary of Vilna. And he was a great scholar. He did not hold any communal office. He was a kind of a Hasid of the old type, who would separate himself from his family, would fast, would do various things that the old Hasidim did. And he signed a ban on Hasidism in the year 1772. This is the ban that came from the town of Brody. Now, why did he do this? And he was very, very passionate in its opposition to Hasidism. He creates a movement that we call misnogdim, which means opponents. Why were they opposed to Hasidism? Well, earlier scholars said, well, it's because the Hasidim really didn't follow Jewish law. But that's not true. The Hasidim followed Jewish law very scrupulously. Sometimes they gave interpretations to the law that were new and different. Kabbalistic or more spiritual, but they were halachic Jews. They did follow Jewish law. They sometimes changed the times of prayer a little bit, but in essence, they really were halachic Jews. So it couldn't have been that they were opposed to Jewish law, even though the opponents argued that they were. They said they did all these crazy things. When they prayed, they stood on their heads, they turned somersaults, various kinds of crazy ideas that are almost certainly not true. So why did he oppose it so vigorously? He was a Kabbalist himself, so it could not be because the Hasidim were influenced by Cabala. Most likely he opposed Hasidism because they were a new type of piety, as we saw before. The Baal Shem Tov's interpretation of Hasidut, of piety, was something different from the old style, and this aroused the opposition of the Gaon of Vilna. And in response to this ban on Hasidism, the Dovber of the Maggid of Mezrich convened a meeting in July of 1772 of his notable disciples, his Hasidim, and they were trying to formulate a response to this attack. It's very possible that they began to see themselves as a movement only when they were attacked in this way. Up until this time, they were simply following a particular teacher. Now they began to conceive of themselves as Hasidim, capital H. In other words, following a new teaching that was constituted a movement. And so the movement itself, we can say, only really begins in the 1770s. The Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760. So it's at least a decade or more after his death that the movement begins to coalesce as an actual movement. Now, what did the Hasidim look like? So this is a wonderful, Jean-Pierre or Piotr Norblin was a portrait artist from France who went to Poland and in about the year 1800 painted pictures of the Jews there. So we might say, I mean, this boy wearing a blue kaftan with a gartel, this belt, and a shtreimel, the fur hat, that he must be Hasid. No, not at all. This is how fairly wealthy Polish Jews would dress for the Sabbath. And so this is important for us because one of the themes I want to touch on is how do you recognize a Hasid when you see him or her? And in the year 1800, it was not so easy. They looked exactly like other Jews of the time. Now, we come to the 19th century. By 1815, all of the early generation, those followers of the Maggid of Mezrich and other of the Hasidic masters of the 18th century had died. This is actually when Shneor Zalman of Liadi, he dies. And so it's now a whole new generation of followers that have to carry the movement forward. And several things happen that are very interesting. The first thing is the movement becomes increasingly dynastic. That is, a leader of a court will pass on his leadership usually to a favored son, often the eldest son, sometimes to a favored disciple, a favored student. These are the people that take the movement, and you can see here that the original area in which Hasidism emerged, which is here where my cursor is, and now it spreads to the west and to the north, and develops many, many centers. Belts is a very important center. We'll get an image of that later on. Lubavitch up here. So this is where the Chabad or Lubavitch Hasidim have their court. But now it is also spread into what is called Central Poland. So Warsaw is somewhere here. It's not on this map. But you can see the incredible spread of the movement in the first half of the 19th century. And this is truly from a demographic point of view when Hasidism has its golden age. It develops many centers, and many of these are actually very wealthy. Some of the courts are very, very wealthy. They build grand buildings. This is the synagogue in Belz. Belz is one of the, as I mentioned before, I showed you on the map, Belz is in an area that is in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is one of the empires that carved up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They built grand palaces for the Rebbe. They lived like aristocrats. Now, this is not all of the courts. This is the big courts, the wealthy courts that were able to do this. And these were grand buildings. And so this is a postcard. It says Gruß aus Belz. You might send this postcard if you were in Belz to show you were there. Perhaps this was not even a Jewish writer who would send the postcard, because it is, of course, here in German. Now, by the way, the Belz Hasidim, who are one of the very prominent groups in Israel today, they have built their synagogue. It's the largest synagogue in Israel. It looks exactly like this, although it's even bigger. So we now get a new phase in Hasidism, which one of the members of our team, David Asaf, has called regal Hasidism. In other words, where certain Hasidic rabbis behave as if they are royalty. And their Hasidim make pilgrimage to the court once, twice a year, depends how far they live from the court. And the court now has many officials. It has cooks, it has servants of various kinds. It has places for the pilgrims to live when they come there. It has a whole ritual of meeting the Rebbe, of having what's called yichidus, which is an individual meeting with a Rebbe in which you gave him a coin. A very ritualized now relationship between Rebbe and Hasid. And this all develops now really in the 19th century. And so much of what we know about Hasidism today, although many of the ideas go back to the 18th century, much of the social structure is 19th century. Here is a wonderful cartoon, also a postcard. You can see somebody has written on it. And here it says in Latin characters, der Rebbe kimmt, der Rebbe kimmt, der Rebbe is schon da. The Rebbe comes, the Rebbe comes, the Rebbe is already here. And here we have him sitting in a carriage. So sometimes the Rebbe would, instead of greeting pilgrims who came to his castle, would go out and meet them in their towns, in their shtetl. And so this is a kind of a cartoon. It's humorous. It shows the Rebbe in his carriage, his driver, and his followers. They come. They are dressed all in this same kind of dress with the kaftan. In this case, they're wearing hats, not fur caps. And we even see a few women here. So this is going to be an important question for us. What was the role of women in Hasidism in the 19th century? Here is another artist who went east to portray the Jews, Leon Holanderski. And in 1846, he painted this picture of, in French, the Chasside sa femme, the Hasid and his wife. Now, this wonderful picture raises very important questions for us. First of all, why does he say the Hasid and his wife? Why not the Hasid and the Hasidah? Is she counted as part of Hasidism, or is she simply attached to it because of her marriage to the Hasid? Well, this is an issue that has generated quite a bit of debate, and we address this issue in our book. We are quite sure that in the 18th century, there were no women associated with Hasidism. In the 19th century, it begins to change. Women adopt certain Hasidic rituals and practices for the home because their husbands are followers of a particular court. Sometimes the women will go to the court themselves and ask for a blessing, for example, if they are unable to have children. So women are beginning to be part of this world, and yet they are still apart. They are not fully a part of it. It's also really interesting to see their dress. 1846 is a very important year. It's coincidental that he drew this picture in this year, but in 1846, Tsar Nicholas I promulgated a law called the Dress Decree, which said that all Jews must adopt modern dress. They should not dress the way they used to, that distinguished them from the Gentile society. And the interesting thing is that the Hasidim, so this is a very typical Hasidic dress. This kind of fur hat is called a shpodek. This is to be found in certain Hasidic groups. The Hasidim decide they are not going to follow this dress decree. And this is in many ways the beginning of the Hasidim differentiating themselves in appearance from other Jews. So they keep their traditional dress, their traditional outfits, and they will now see this as a mark of the difference between Hasidism and the rest of the Jewish world. And this is part of a larger resistance to modernization. The Hasidim now become increasingly defined by their refusal to adopt modern customs. And so we find them, for example, this is now the early 20th century. This is the Rebbe of Belz. Here he is actually at one of the spas in Bohemia, in Western Czechoslovakia. He and his followers are at the spa. They are dressed now in distinctively Hasidic dress, no longer common Jewish dress, but now distinctively Hasidic. And they are to be found, and it's actually interesting. We have descriptions of them going to these spas to, as they say, take the waters. Franz Kafka actually describes seeing the Rebbe of Belz at one of the spas that he went to. And so this is a picture from that time. Now, I'm going to move forward rather quickly here, so we have plenty of time for questions. In World War I, Hasidism undergoes a very major change because much of the warfare that takes place in Eastern Europe takes place in areas of the Hasidic towns. Many of the courts have to relocate to cities. Vienna or Warsaw are the primary cities, Vienna or Warsaw. And so Hasidism now becomes a much more urban phenomenon, which it had not been previously. In the interwar period, Hasidism in Poland, Ger is one of the largest groups in Poland. Today, it is the largest group in Israel. And you can get a sense this is the wedding of the son of the Rebbe of Ger. It is a mass movement. At the same time, though, the Hasidim are fighting a battle against secularization. Many Jews in Poland abandon religion and embrace secular political identities, Zionism, Bundism, communism. We have accounts actually of the children of rebbes who become communists. So this is a period of great ferment of revolt within the Jewish world, and the Hasidim, despite their numbers, begin to feel themselves very threatened. They even use the word in the 1937, one Hasidic leader speaks of the coming Shoah. He doesn't mean, of course, the Holocaust as we know it, because, of course, it hadn't happened yet. No one could predict it. He means that the Hasidic world is going to be destroyed by secularization. You can even see this in this wonderful picture. This is really one of my favorite pictures from our book. Pearl Rabinowitz, she's the daughter of the Biale Rebbe. The Biale Hasidim, I am not connected with them at all. My name is, the word Biale means white in Slavic languages. So my name was originally Białogowski in Polish. And then my father shortened it and gave it a very Protestant American pronunciation, Bial. So anyway, she, as daughter of the Biale Rebbe, they were a very, very pious group of Hasidim. She ended up marrying into a different Hasidic group, and she and her husband were murdered in the Holocaust. This is a picture from the 1920s. And one of the things that is so striking about the picture is how modern she looks. You know, this is a studio photograph. I mean, she goes into the studio and the photographer sets it up in a certain way, but she is very happy to be photographed, you know, with these necklace, with a modern dress. And this is an indication that actually there is a lot of interesting things going on within the Hasidic world between the wars. Now, of course, the Holocaust destroys much of Hasidism in Eastern Europe. And this is a subject unto itself that I could give you a whole separate lecture about. I won't do that now. Hasidism, most of the Hasidim in Eastern Europe are murdered during the Holocaust. They are easily identified. They perhaps have more difficulty escaping. Although actually in many ways they also resisted, and that's an important part of the story. They were very committed to making sure that their rebbes survived. And so one of the reasons, I think, that after World War II, Hasidism was able to rise like a phoenix out of the ashes, to create out of only maybe several tens of thousands of surviving Hasidim, to create a community today that is probably worldwide 750,000 Hasidim. How did they do this? One of the ways they did it is because some of the most important rebbes were able to survive. The Rebbe of Chabad, Lubavitch, Yaakov Yosef Schneerson, escaped to the United States. The Rebbe of Ger escaped to Palestine. The Rebbe of Belz escaped during the war, was able to get across the border from Poland to Hungary, and from Hungary he went to Palestine. So some of the most important rebbes escaped. A few survived the camps, but they were able to rebuild because the leaders were still there. So now I want to go on very briefly again to the subject of Hasidic dress and women in Hasidism. This is a wonderful picture. The Toldot Aharon group is a very, very conservative group in Jerusalem. They are originally of Hungarian origin. There is no question, I think, that this woman identifies as a member of this group. She is a Hasidah. We see her praying here. She wears very distinctive clothing that is marks her as being of the Toldot Aharon. She shaves her head after she marries and wears a black scarf. Not all of the women do this in different groups. So now we have a situation where the different Hasidic groups distinguish themselves one from another by the way they dress and by their customs. So I think it's fair to say that today, women very much are Hasidot. They are part of the Hasidic movement. I'll tell you a very amusing anecdote from our group. We had a big debate about this. And one member of our group insisted, no, 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 women are not, they are not part of Hasidism. They are at most wives or daughters of Hasidim. Well, another member of our group said, you're wrong. They are part of Hasidism. So how do we settle this quarrel? Well, the second person said, I have the email of the Gabbai, the kind of secretary of the Rebbe of Munkach. I'll send him an email. Sends him an email. He says, are women Hasidot? He gets an answer in 30 seconds, yes. So I think that's true. I think that's still the case. I think women are very much a part of this movement now. And we even have evidence, actually, and this is in one of the courts of Viznitz, which is a Hungarian-Romanian group, of a widow of the Rebbe who holds a tish, that is a table where she gives a sermon. She throws what are called shiraim, pieces of bread, to the Hasidim around the table. This is unheard of, that a woman should do this. Although we do have a few cases in the 19th century of women who actually acted as rebbes, and those are very interesting exceptions that we discuss in the book. So back to our book and the question of dress. So we see here, this is a wonderful picture from the beginning of the 20th century from Jerusalem, this turns out to be a great-grandfather and his great-grandson. And I selected this picture for the cover of the book because I thought it was such a beautiful picture. You know, it's very important, I think, in studying Hasidism. It's so easy to see them as some kind of alien people, you know, exotic, different, somehow, you know, not people we can identify with, to see them actually as very human. And that's what I think this picture does. Well, we chose the picture and we were already in production when one of the members of our group said, I don't think they're Hasidim. There were Jews in Jerusalem that dressed this way. They were called Yerushalmim. If you've seen the Israeli series called Shtisel, I don't know if it came to Brazil. Wonderful, wonderful series. They are not Hasidim. They are Yerushalmim. They dress like Hasidim, but they don't have a Rebbe. So this was a big problem. The book was already in production. We were very worried that somebody on Facebook would say, you've put people who are not Hasidim on the cover. And then we did some more research and we discovered, yes, they are Hasidim. This man is actually the son of the second Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch. And this is his great-grandson. But sure enough, when the book was published, somebody on Facebook said, they're not Hasidim, to which I could answer, they are, we did the research. But it was a very tense moment, actually. So I want to say just a word or two about Hasidism in modern culture. So this is really quite crazy. The fashion designer Jean-Paul Gaultier dressed up his models in Hasidic dress, which is, you know, heretical on several counts. First of all, women do not dress the way men do. That's already in the Bible. Secondly, only Hasidim dress this way, not fashion models. This is an indication that Hasidism, the image of Hasidism, has become part of general culture, which I find very interesting. He even had them walking on the streets of New York and had real Hasidim react to seeing these models. It's a kind of, must have been very shocking, actually. Right, I had one more picture that I somehow didn't make it in here. But what I want to say uh, is that Hasidism has become very much a part of modern culture, and there are, of course, many now representations of Hasidism in the media, in film, in television series. Some of you may have seen this film Unorthodox. Again, I don't know if it came to Brazil. And this is about a young woman in the Satmar group who has a terrible marriage. She flees to Berlin, where she's adopted by all kinds of sort of bohemian artists and intellectuals there. It's based on an actual memoir, but what I want to say, I actually didn't like it at all. I thought it was very stereotyped and very inauthentic, actually. But my main criticism is, and this goes to other representations of Hasidism in modern culture, there is an obsession with people who leave. In other words, it's the rebels. It's the people who want to be part of the modern world. They don't want to be stuck in this medieval, antiquated world. They rebel and they leave. And of course, there are such people, and that story is an important story. But equally important is to understand the people who stay. Why do they stay? What do they find there? What is their culture actually like? How does it work? What is the relationship between the genders? Rather than the stereotyped representation, we need to go into greater depth, into understanding, especially the role of women. I tell you an anecdote. This is from my late sister. My sister was in Chabad, and she lived in London in the ultra-Orthodox community in Stamford Hill. And she died very young, tragically. And when I was there at the Shiva, first of all, the son, one of the many sons of the Vishnitz Rebbe, came in to pay a condolence call. And since he saw that there were women sitting there in the living room, he refused to do it in front of women. He insisted on only the men in the family go to a different room. Well, soon afterwards, a woman from Satmar came in. It turned out she had arranged all of my sister's care in the last weeks of her life. She was an unbelievably impressive woman. And I realized the stereotypical portrait of women in Hasidism is simply wrong, and it has to be revised. And as scholars interested in this phenomenon today, we need to pay attention not only to those who leave, but also to those who stay. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I hope you have some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. I could listen to you and talk about Hasidism for like hours and hours and hours, because it's the most interesting subject. Well, I'm interested in that. So I'm sorry, everybody, but I think everybody's interested in that. So I'm going to start from the last part of your lecture. And you talked about unorthodox. Unorthodox was even translated into a book in Portuguese. Her book, yeah, Deborah Feldman. Yeah. And don't you think that this book, so unorthodox, there are many ones, and there's one, Uncovered, How I Left Hasidic Life and Finally Came Home, that Those Who Go Do Not Return by Scholem Din. It's like a literary genre, don't you think?
It's a genre. It's become a genre, yes. It's become a genre, and there seems to be a great appetite for such books in the general public, which I find very interesting. You know, and some of these stories are not false. I mean, Scholem Din's story is very tragic.
It is.
He loses all contact with his children. It's horrible. And these are, of course, real stories. So they deserve to be told. But it's very important, I think. There was a movie, I don't know if this came to your attention in Brazil, called One of Us. It's a documentary about
on Netflix, yeah.
4 different people who leave the Hasidic world. I was actually one of the resource scholars for the movie, and I was very unhappy with it. I felt that, again, the portrait of Hasidism, of why people stay, was missing from the account of these people who left. And I even found out later that there was something very false in the movie. Of course, they do recreations. In other words, so there's one woman who we see her on the phone with, with her husband. She's splitting up from him. It's a terrible argument on the phone. It's recreated. Maybe it happened that way, maybe it didn't. It turns out that the reason that woman left is that she found out she was lesbian. And why didn't they tell that story? That's a really important, interesting story. That is, of people who discover that their sexuality cannot find a expression in that community. There's a more recent book that is about these people who live half lives in that world and half out, by excuse me, I can't remember the name of the author now. It'll come back to me in a moment.
Or you can send me the name later.
Anthropologist in New York, and I know her, but I forgot her name for the
Maybe
moment,
I know the book. I think I have here.
So,
I'm going to check later. Yeah. Degrees of separation? Maybe degrees of separation? No.
That's not it. No. Anyway, I mean, what she documents, I think, and is very interesting, is people who realize that they can't stay in this world because, for various reasons, some of it having to do with sexuality. But on the other hand, they can't leave either. They don't want to lose their children the way Scholem did. And so they live double lives. During the day, they're Hasidim, and then at night, they change their clothes and they go out. And so, and this is a phenomenon that's known in New York, it's known in Israel. I'm sure it's true in other places as well. It's very interesting. This phenomenon is, of course, a real phenomenon, because as in any human community, there are a certain percentage of the people who are in fact homosexual. And and I think we try, at least I try, to make this part of normal life, and this world cannot tolerate that. That really is a red line they can't cross. And so these people have to find a way of negotiating it. It's extremely difficult. There is there's an article actually in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, about a therapist who herself is Haredi, is ultra-Orthodox, and she works with people in the Haredi world, and especially tries to work with people who are homosexual and are torn because their world does not tolerate it. And she says there are some very rare cases where she recommends, excuse the expression, chemical castration. In other words, they basically take a hormone blocker that wipes out their sexual drive, because they say either I leave or I stay. I can't stay. I have to lead a double life. I don't want to lead a double life, and I don't want to lose my children. And so this is very tragic.
Very tragic.
But it's part of some of the difficulties that these communities have in the modern world.
Sure. I'm going to ask about how do you see Hasidism reinventing itself and flourishing in 2023? But I'm going to quote page 769, because it's according to what you said, and it's brilliant. That is, even those who lose their will to remain Hasidic often remain within the boundaries of the Hasidic community, unable or unwilling to live a life outside it is outside it in spite of their loss of faith. So powerful is the nature of contemporary Hasidic life that even rebels often remain hidden within it. So it's very nice. And so I come to the preface of the book that you talk about the flourishing and the reinvention of Hasidism in our century. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the, I would even call it a mystery that I mean, I tried to suggest how they did this after World War II. They rebuilt themselves. We know some of the details of this. Obviously, what happened initially is they recruited usually survivors who were not necessarily Hasidim before the war. They may have been traditional Jews, and in trying to relocate into different places, New York, Israel, they found a home in a Hasidic court, even if they hadn't been Hasidim earlier. Sometimes they wanted their children to have a traditional Orthodox education. And so it was through the children that they themselves became Hasidic. And then, of course, after a generation or two, they begin to rebuild just by virtue of having very large families.
Of course, yes.
Having, in the case of Israel, the support of the welfare system. We know about this, and even now the most recent budget passed by the state of Israel gives enormous amounts of money to these communities, so they benefit from that. But the way in which they see themselves, I think, is very, very interesting. One phenomenon, because they have such large families and they can't afford housing in cities like Bnei Brak in Israel or Brooklyn in New York, they have to establish outposts outside in places like in Israel, Emmanuel, Beitar Elite. These are in a way going back to their roots as being semi-rural. In other words, go from the city out into the countryside into smaller towns. Or in the case of the Satmar in New York, they have Kiryas Yoel north of the city. The Square Hasidim have New Square. So there's this movement out of the city, whereas in 100 years ago, it was into the city. So that's an interesting new phenomenon. You know, we think, our group discussed this quite a bit. We think that the internet is the greatest danger to the Hasidic communities. And this is why they are very, very adamant that people should not use the internet. They should have kosher phones.
Kosher phones, yeah.
Kosher phone, where you can't connect to the internet because what's on the internet is very dangerous. Mm-hmm. Now, we're beginning to realize that this is true for all of us. Actually.
Yes.
The internet is an addiction, and it's very dangerous, especially to children. I don't know in Brazil if this is being discussed, but in America, it's a very big discussion now of the damage that these phones are doing to adolescents in particular, to teenagers. But for the Hasidim, it's a different kind of danger. It's a danger of secular ideas, sexual images, and so forth. So they campaign against this. And we think that they will, like every other group that's trying to fight the internet, they will fail.
Yeah, they're not going to win.
Already failing. That there are, even if the Hasidim claim, well, no, we only have a kosher phone, they probably have a real phone hidden somewhere. It is so tempting. It's like a drug. And I think that we will see the results of this in one more generation, because there is a certain percentage of people who leave. It's not a large percentage, but it is probably growing. And the internet is almost certainly going to be their greatest challenge.
Perfect.
So
Yeah. So talking about power and strength, I would like to ask about Chabad because it's a reality here in Brazil as well. While you were talking, Professor, I was taking a look at Chabad's website here in Brazil, and in São Paulo, we have like 30 something institutions, just São Paulo state, okay? But in
Oh,
Brazil, just São Paulo state, São Paulo, the city of São Paulo, we have like 25 schools and yes, schools and temples and everything, and 50 in Brazil, 50, okay?
50. It's,
So yeah, it's amazing. And I think it's a presence here for you, just for you to have an idea. We don't hear about Satmar, for example. We just hear about Chabad Lubavitch here in Brazil. Here in Brazil, it's there like everywhere, and sometimes people consider. As we study contemporary Judaism and as we talk to so many people about Jewish life and about who the real Jews are, those terrible questions, people often say, Brazilian people often say, well, the real Jews are those ones that walk around with the hats and with the coats and everything. So I would like to ask you about this, and I'm going to connect about the pilgrimage to the tombs and to the places where the rabbis are buried like saints. And here in Brazil it's something absolutely common because it's a Catholic country, so everybody goes to the cemeteries and the homages and a peregrination pilgrimage. So I would like you to talk about it.
yeah, so Chabad is unique. Already back when in the 18th century, Schneur Zalman, he didn't really like having all the Hasidim coming and bothering him at his court. So he developed a system which are called shluchim, or emissaries. These were people who were sent out to where his Hasidim lived, and they would take his message. In other words, they were messengers of the Rebbe.
Mm-hmm.
So this system already existed for him at the beginning of Chabad. And they're very unusual, particularly in the 20th century, because the last Rebbe of Lubavitch, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, actually was trained as an engineer
Yes.
in France. So he had contact with the secular world. His wife studied literature at the University of Berlin. Chabad under the last Rebbe Schneerson actually is very open to the modern world, very open to the modern world. And they have less trouble with this idea of kosher phone or internet. They use the internet. It was his idea, because it was part of the messianic ideology of Chabad that actually goes back to his father-in-law, the sixth Rebbe, possibly even to the Rebbe before him.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that the Messiah is coming, and the role of Chabad is to prepare for the Messiah. And then his followers, the seventh Rebbe, they decided they wanted him to be the Messiah. We don't know if he considered himself Messiah or not. He gave various hints. Yes, no, he may, played it very kind of,
Yes.
played a game with followers. But after he died, some of his followers decided that he really wasn't dead. He was somewhere, he was going to come back as Messiah.
Until today, yeah. From
Today,
1994 to today, yeah.
Yeah, there are still those who believe that. There are those who reject that. In other words, the movement, the interesting thing is that the movement split, and yet it didn't really split. It continues as Chabad, even though there are groups that really disagree with each other. So, for example, in London, the Chabad there were members of the Chabad community who wanted to say, "Yechi Adonenu Rabbeinu Melech HaMashiach," long live our King, our Lord, the King Messiah, and they were thrown out of the synagogue. They had to establish a different synagogue. So you'd think that they would split, but they didn't really split. They're still, without a Rebbe, without a living Rebbe, they have continued because Menachem Mendel Schneerson was a great organizer, and he created an infrastructure that is so powerful that it continues without a Rebbe. They are the only movement that does this, with the exception of Bratslav, which is very small, kind of New Age Hasidism. And the Bratslav Hasidim, founded by Nachman of Bratslav, who died in 1810, they never had a Rebbe after Nachman. They were called by other Hasidim the Tota Hasidim, the dead Hasidim, because they followed a dead Rebbe. And they were persecuted by other Hasidim for this. They were considered crazy. Today, though, they are having their own revival, partly because of a kind of New Age spirituality that they have tapped into. So Chabad is remarkable. They have motivated their rabbis to go out and to establish these Chabad institutions in countries like Brazil that don't have large Jewish population, right? I don't know, what is the number of how many?
120,000.
Okay, that's not small.
No,
it's not small.
I think it's the 10th.
Yeah, it's not.
No, not that small. No. In São Paulo,
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
They send people to places where there are no Jews. And they are truly, I think we could call them chalutzim, pioneers. They're willing to go and to suffer, to live in a community where you can't get kosher food, and establish a Chabad house where you have very little, financial support. They don't get any money from the central New York office.
Probably not, yeah.
No, they have to raise their own money. And they're quite remarkable. I mean, my nephew, so I have the side of my family, it's in Chabad, and also my wife, who's Israeli, she has a nephew who's Chabad rabbi, so I tell you stories about both. So my nephew, Mendy, lives in London, and he decided to open a Chabad house in Islington, which is a very posh neighborhood, very secular. They told him there's no way you will succeed there. The Jews are not interested there in anything religious. He's a huge success. He's very close to the local politicians. He holds a Passover Seder on the Thames on a barge. He has all kinds of original ideas, and he's a very charismatic guy, and he's very successful. And I really admire him, that he did this. And on my wife's side, her nephew Dotan, he became Chabad, like many who go, Israelis after the army, they go to India, and Chabad is very strong there. And the Israelis want to go to some place where they can get hummus, so they go to Chabad, and then one thing leads to another, and they become Chabad. So
yes.
He is Chabad. And he's a great success. He was on a very stupid Israeli television show, which has new people who are about to get married, couples that are about to get married, and they have a quiz show. They compete to answer questions, and they compete against a guest. So he was brought on as a guest. And they thought, well, he will know nothing about contemporary Israeli culture. And they were asking questions, very trivial questions about Israeli music. And he got one after the other. And they said, how did you do this? And he said, you see this? It used to be here.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see how these Chabad shluchim, these emissaries, these messengers, how they are able to speak a modern language, to connect with the people they want to recruit, and they're very, very good at that. Now, you mentioned Satmar. Satmar is deliberately the opposite. Satmar does not. They do not recruit. And you know, the Rebbe of Satmar, Yoel Teitelbaum, I would think it was Teitelbaum, said that Chabad is the closest thing to Judaism.
Yeah, there is that.
Yeah. So they don't recruit. They you know, it's based on natural growth, really. You know, fertility. So it's very different. They have no interest in speaking a modern language. Although, you know, in places like Williamsburg, which is their headquarters, Williamsburg in New York and Brooklyn, it's become a kind of a hipster neighborhood where, you know, you have young professionals. They have to interact with them. Many of these young professionals rent their apartments from Satmar landlords. So there is an interaction there that's quite interesting.
Very interesting.
So they cannot escape the modern world. They cannot segregate themselves off totally. There's no way around. They have to interact with it.
We have a couple of questions from the chat. They are very interesting, and then then I'm going to ask you first, then I'm going to ask you the second one. Professor, do you see some danger in relation to artificial intelligence in the Hasidic world?
Well, that's a great question.
Great question
It's a great question. First of all, I have to say I know very little about artificial intelligence. Although what I do know is in the United States, artificial intelligence went from being something very cool, very, you know, to something that's now an insult. You know, you now say, oh, you let artificial intelligence write that. It's a way of saying it's stupid, you know? So, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And you know what, I'm going to ask, I have a former student of mine is now teaching religious studies at Stanford University. He is a great scholar of Hasidism. He actually worked for us as our research assistant when he was doing his PhD dissertation. Now he's published 2 books on Hasidism that are fantastic.
It's Ariel?
Ariel Mace, yes.
Oh, he's just brilliant and so young.
Yeah. He's brilliant. And he's become very interested in AI. So I'm going to ask him that question. I'm not going to try to answer it myself. I think he will have a good answer of what AI means for Hasidism.
Perfect. And the last question, do you think that for being apart from the society, Hasidism are usually blamed for anti-Semitism?
I mean, I think that, you know, the problem with anti-Semites is they will always find a Jew to hate, no matter what the Jew looks like. So the Jew could be completely modern, you know, it could be George Soros.
Yes.
They hate George Soros. He's not religious, you know, because he has a lot of money, right? Or they could focus on these people who look different. You know, it's very hard, I think, to say. My sense is that sometimes Hasidim, I mean, I'm thinking now in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, it was believed that, no, the Jews do not commit ritual murder. No, this is a medieval myth. It's not true. But there's this sect called Hasidim. Yeah, they may do that, you know. So in other words, there are conspiracy theories that can be attached to Hasidism because they are different. I don't think today, and I am not an expert on contemporary anti-Semitism, but my feeling is that anti-Semites have many targets to choose from, and not just Hasidim.
I agree with you, and that's the problem that we have here in Brazil. We are facing the same thing. Well, everything that you said about the United States is the same reality in Brazil, sometimes a little bit late. It arrives here a little bit some years later. Professor, I would like to thank you so much for your book, for your presentations, and it was really, really an honor to have you here with us. I cannot open the microphones and the cameras, but everybody's clapping and saying thank you. So I thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon. And it will be our honor if you would come to Brazil and talk to us. Maybe.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Obrigada, gente. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.